Mr. President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak on the nomination of Professor Lisa Cook to serve as a governor of the Federal Reserve Board. At stake with Professor Cook's nomination is really how the Fed will respond to one of the most pressing challenges facing Pennsylvania and the nation. Earlier this month, we learned that inflation hit a 4-decade high of almost 8%. Prices are skyrocketing for just about everything: gasoline, food, rent. The amount of money Americans have to pay for basic goods and services that they need every week are going up, and they're going up much faster than their wages. That means working Americans are falling further and further behind. Now, under the guise of fighting this inflation, my colleagues across the aisle on the Senate Banking Committee have urged the swift confirmation of President Biden's slate of nominees to the Federal Reserve Board. The chairman of the committee said that President Biden's nominees are, quote, ready to get to work fighting inflation. And yet we could have confirmed nominees many weeks ago. Still haven't voted on two of the nominees that have unanimous Republican support and near unanimous Democrat support, which makes you wonder about our colleagues' commitment to this urgency. Well, maybe it's because our Democratic colleagues know that even if we don't confirm these nominees, the Fed has 9 out of 12 voting members on the FOMC in place. That is more than enough to raise rates if they decide they should raise rates to fight inflation. How do we know for sure that that's more than enough? Well, at their last meeting just 2 weeks ago, the Fed did, in fact, raise interest rates. So it was never the case that the Fed is somehow unable to fight inflation until the nominees are confirmed. So what we really should be asking ourselves is, are these nominees going to be the inflation fighters that we need, that the White House claims they are? In my view, one of these nominees in particular, Professor Lisa Cook, dramatically fails this test. First of all, Professor Cook has nearly zero experience in monetary policy. Now, she does have a PhD in economics, but not a single one of her publications concerns monetary economics. The White House cites as her main qualification on U.S. monetary policy her appointment as a Chicago Fed director. That appointment was made in January of this year, 2 weeks before President Biden announced Professor Cook's nomination to be a Fed governor. And Professor Cook made very clear in her conversation with me that she had not participated in any policy or decision-making so far in her term at the Chicago Fed. In fact, she described her role as limited to filling out paperwork. That's her quote for her new position, which is understandable. She'd been there for 2 weeks before she was nominated to the Fed governorship. So that appointment to the regional Fed certainly doesn't count as a qualification to serve as a Maine Fed governor. Professor Cook herself has acknowledged that her academic work on monetary issues is, let's say, sparse. When asked to list her top few works on monetary policy for the Banking Committee, she provided only one, and that was a book chapter about Nigerian bank reforms in 2005. What's even more troubling is that in addition to having no monetary policy experience, Professor Cook also appears to have no opinion at all on how the Fed should address inflation. Professor Cook repeatedly refused to endorse the Fed's decision to pull back its ultra-easy monetary policy, and only did begrudgingly say that she agreed with the Fed's path right now as we're speaking, that's a quote, at her nomination hearing in February. Prior to that, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that maybe it was time for the Fed to change the policy that had contributed to the worst inflation that we've seen in 40 years. Professor Cook's answers to basic questions about what tools the Fed should use and how should the Fed consider using them in order to get inflation under control, her answer was nothing more than an incomprehensible word salad. Professor Cook has continued to insist that she would need to be confirmed to the Fed before she can have a view on inflation because, in her own words, and I quote, "We don't have access to all the data that the Fed has," end quote. And also, quote, "We don't have access to the deliberations at the time they're being made," end quote. Now, these statements are bewildering coming from someone who's been nominated to address the most pressing inflationary threat in nearly 2 generations. To be clear, the Fed has no secret data, as Professor Cook seems to believe. In fact, monetary policy, including the recent 41% increase in the money supply, is extremely transparent. And if Professor Cook is counting on Fed economists to guide her in making a prediction about inflation, then first of all, they've been wrong on inflation consistently, very wrong. And secondly, what is she going to do on the Fed? What is her role there if all she's going to do is take instruction from the Fed staff? Look, I mean, just about every economist in the country has an opinion about inflation right now because the data is all readily apparent and extremely disturbing. Every other nominee to the Federal Reserve has an opinion about inflation. And certainly every Pennsylvanian I talk to has strongly held views about inflation. Professor Cook's claim made at her nomination hearing just last month that, and I quote, "We have to be patient with the data," end quote. And the data she was referring to was rising consumer prices. That certainly suggests what is to me an unacceptable toleration for the inflation that's ravaging American consumers. And that brings me to my second point, and that is Professor Cook's history of extreme left-wing political advocacy and hostility to opposing viewpoints, the combination of which I think makes her unfit to serve on the Fed. As I've said many times, it's extremely important that we keep politics out of the money supply. The Fed is supposed to be independent. The Fed is supposed to be apolitical so that it can focus on its job. But unfortunately, we've seen the encroachment of politics at the historically independent Federal Reserve, and we've seen that the Fed's not doing such a great job. There are people on the left, including in the Biden administration, who openly advocate that the Fed use its regulatory powers to address complex political issues, including things like what to do about global warming, social justice, even education policy. Look, these are all very, very important issues. Very important issues. But they're completely unrelated to the Fed's limited statutory mandate and expertise. Professor Cook's record indicates that these are the topics that interest her the most, and she's likely to inject further political bias into the Fed's work at a time, exactly the time, when we need the Fed to be hyper-focused on getting inflation back under control. We discovered that Professor Cook sent out, in recent years, over 30,000 public tweets and retweets. 30,000. Included among them, she supports race-based reparations, she's promoted conspiracies about Georgia voting laws, she sought to cancel those who disagree with her views, such as she publicly called for a colleague of hers to be fired because he dared to tweet that he was opposed to defunding the police of Chicago. And after Banking Committee Republican staff highlighted these tweets and brought them to public attention, Professor Cook blocked the Banking Committee Republican Twitter account 1 day before her nomination hearing. Apparently, Professor Cook not only realizes how inflammatory her own tweets are, but also has pretty little regard for the Senate's constitutional responsibility to vet her public statements. See, the Fed is already suffering from a credibility problem because of its involvement in politics, its departure from its statutorily prescribed limited role, and frankly, the not very good job it's done in keeping inflation under control. I'm concerned that Professor Cook will further politicize an institution that must get back to being apolitical. So I urge my colleagues to vote against the motion to discharge Professor Cook, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,